My mother at the time attempted to have an abortion. By God's grace alone, that abortion didn't work out, and my mum had to go through with the pregnancy. Eventually my dad, to cope with the struggle of the stuff that he had done, he would take to the drink, take to drugs, but every night that he would do that, he would get extremely physical, and he'd come home and my mum would just be the first thing in the way. Instead of my dad reacting like he did when I was younger, like getting violent or aggressive, he sits me down on my bed, shares with me a Bible verse and prays for me, and he asked if I would want to ask Jesus into my life. Hello, my name is Fal. I'm originally from Fiji, and this is my testimony. So I grew up in Fiji, and my mum, she was currently studying to be a nurse, and my dad was a policeman. And they met on a night out together, and they had a one-night stand and had a wee mistake happen, and that was me. Fiji at the time was very traditional and conservative in its ways, and my mum was a young nurse, only 18. My dad was a policeman, also young and not married. Wedlock was extremely taboo, and both of them were stuck in tough situations. And my mother at the time attempted to have an abortion. By God's grace alone, that abortion didn't work out, and my mum had to go through with the pregnancy. Both sides of my mum's and dad's family wanted them to get married, and eventually ended up forcing the fact that those two would get married and have a family together. So my mum and dad were kind of stuck with me from that point on. Going into this family, I both felt love from both sides, but also felt like at times it was forced. And my dad extremely struggled with alcohol at the time. While he was a policeman in Fiji, Fiji went through this thing called a coup, where the police and the army came together to overtake the current government at the time and put another person in charge. And my dad at the time had to do some extremely difficult things and stuff that he really struggled to live with. Dad definitely started to show signs of PTSD, and when I was younger, my dad would wake up in the middle of the night like screaming, start pacing around the room. Eventually my dad, to cope with the struggle of the stuff that he had done, he would take to the drink, take to drugs, and just do all those things every night. But every night that he would do that, he would get extremely physical, and he'd come home and my mum would just be the first thing in the way. You could hear it from my room like downstairs. My mum would get beat up by my dad, and my dad would just be rampantly out of control, and there's not very much that dad's family or my mum's family could do about it. So we lived through years of domestic abuse in the household. It got to a point where I was at an age where I would try and stand in the way of these things happening. I'd run downstairs and try and get in the way, and I would catch a couple of punches or get kicked as well. Already living with the fact that I kind of knew that I was a mistake. Being hit by my dad was like just another part that was causing serious issues in my own mental health. And being so young, I was like, my dad's like meant to be the one who like loves me the most, and he's the one who's abusing me at this moment. There were points where me and my mum would end up having to leave the house because dad would get so physical. So there were nights that we spent out in the streets and would have slept. If we couldn't get a friend's house to go stay with, we would have slept outside. Those times were difficult to get through, and it's hard to even think of something like, is there a God in a situation like this? And for years I resented my dad, resented my mum. My mum at the time was coming along to a church and having thoughts about Christianity and God, and I was at a point of like, why is she doing this? Like, there's no way that there's a God because of what we're going through at that moment. We had a breakthrough where my dad signed up to join the army, the British military, and I was 5 at the time, and my dad got enrolled and we got the opportunity to move to England. And at that time we thought moving to England was a massive like deal. We'll move to England, life will be so much better, there's more money there, there's more opportunities for jobs, and because we'll have all those things, life will be so much better. And instead of like dealing with the things that were going on in our household, we thought we could just escape and go somewhere that would just make it better. Well, when we arrived in England and my dad joined the army, it actually got worse. The party culture was worse here. Drinking in England was every night after work. So dad would continue to drink, come home, and continue to be violent with my mum and me. Going through all those things at that time, I was also didn't speak English. So I was in school trying to learn English, and I would also be coming into school with bruises. My mum would start working as a nurse in England and she'd have bruises to cover up. We were all just keeping this on the down low. But the difference this time is in Fiji, we had people that we could run to. We had family that we could talk to about all these things. But in England, we had no one. We were just isolated and stuck. My parents then had my sister. It seemed at the time that my dad had slightly matured a bit, but the introduction of a new child then seemed to put on more pressure financially, more pressure to provide for the family, and then that just drove my dad in another downward spiral, and same thing, another violent circle would happen, except now that there was a baby in the household as well. We then moved around a lot with the army, and it was the same for a long time. By the time that I got to go to secondary school, we moved to Northern Ireland, and I got the opportunity to get a rugby scholarship and got to go to a school in Harrogate. I couldn't think of anything better, because this was a opportunity to get out of the house, to not be around my dad, to not be in this vicious circle. As soon as they said that, I was like, Mum, Dad, please just send me. Loads of people always ask me now, do you not feel like you were neglected when your parents sent you to boarding school? But I already felt neglected from birth, and I already felt like I wasn't very much wanted in the household. So I took the opportunity with both hands, and I ended up going to boarding school. While I went to boarding school for my first year, something miraculous happened in my family, and my dad ended up becoming a Christian. When that happened, I was so resentful of my dad, and so doubtful that anyone could save a man that vicious and that violent all the time. There's no way that could happen. There's no way God would want to save someone like that. So I played along with what my dad was saying, and he would continue to take us to church and take us to all these things when I would come home, and he would continuously encourage me to read the Bible and pray. But I would say yes, knowing that I wasn't listening to anything that my dad said because of what I'd experienced in the past. Like, all I had in my head was that he was violent and he doesn't love me and doesn't really want the best for me in my life. So when my dad told me those things, it actually did the opposite and had the opposite effect. And instead of ever reading my Bible, when I went back to boarding school, I just kind of tucked it away in a cupboard, didn't tell anyone that my dad had become a Christian. Boarding school was one of the worst places for the ability to get alcohol. So when I was 12, it was like one of the first times that I had a sip of alcohol at a house party that my friend was throwing. And then 13, 14, we were introduced to drugs. Because of the friends that I hung out with, and because of them being very rich and them having their own family issues where parents wouldn't be around, they would think that pleasing their kids is by giving them anything they wanted. Whenever we had house parties, there would be alcohol to drink for days. So I would jump into the same cycle that my dad did. I would go out, go to the house party, get absolutely smashed. The same way as I joined the rugby team, I basically wanted to be the coolest guy in the school. So by doing that, I was doing whatever they were doing. So they were like, we're going to drink and get absolutely wasted this weekend, like every day this weekend. I'm like, yeah, that's the cool thing to do. At the same time, my dad is messaging me Bible verses, like saying that he's praying for me, but I absolutely hate him because of all the stuff that had happened in the past, and I really struggle to forgive him for the things that he'd done to me. I was getting better at rugby. I was making teams that I never thought I could make. Got to play for my district, got to play for my county, eventually got to play for England under 17s. When I got picked for the team, when I was doing well in school, when I was popular with my friends, all the things that my dad kept telling me about this need of a savior, life was going well for me. At that point, I was like, what's my need of a savior? I got picked for the under 17s England team, and I go to play my first game, and I go in for my first tackle, and I broke my collarbone and tore my rotator cuff off the bone. Couldn't play for the rest of the year. My life was like destroyed. I was in a position where I was like, I don't think I could be anything else but a rugby player. And this is my final year of school and probably my biggest opportunity to be a professional. That whole year was one of the toughest years for me because I'd lost purpose. My friends who I thought were my friends, who I thought would be the ones who'd keep me uplifted, kind of disappeared off into the background, kept doing what they were doing. So they were continuing to go out and get drunk, but I couldn't because of the nature of my injury. I had to be really careful with the way that I treated my shoulder. So I wasn't going out drinking with them. Friends kind of filtered away. And I was at a point where I was at my lowest, and extremely depressed, not knowing if the thing that I thought I could do in the future was going to be possible anymore. And it was at that point that my dad would constantly ring me, send me Bible verses, say that he's praying for me. And I was so angry at him. You're the last person I want to hear from. My dad, out of the blue, comes and visits me. They let him into my room, and I was like, what are you doing here? Like, I was like, honestly, Dad, you're the last person that I want to see. My dad comes over and gives me a hug, and I flip and just break down. But I'm raging at him. So I start screaming at him in his face, just telling him of all the hurt that he'd done to me in the past, and everything just came out. Instead of my dad reacting like he did when I was younger, like getting violent or aggressive, he sits me down on my bed, shares with me a Bible verse and prays for me. And he asked if I would want to ask Jesus into my life. And at that point I was like, I don't know, Dad, like I'm too broken at this point. And then my dad said, he said the words, "I love you." And I'd never heard my dad say that before. And everything that I thought when I was younger was completely taken away at that moment when he said it. And I was like broken. I was already in tears, and now I'm like weeping. He's crying, and instead of him stopping at that moment and just comforting me, he shares with me the gospel. And I had heard the gospel a million times, but at that point it just made sense. And at the point of my disparity, at the point where I was completely broken, it seemed like Jesus showed up. And like in that room, it was so tangible. And we both asked that Jesus would come into my life. At that moment, I just knew that I was saved. My dad left, and I was still stuck in a pretty difficult situation of, what's my life going to come to? And there was a bit more of a peace around my life at that moment, but I was still struggling with my injury and struggling with what my life would come to in the future. There were points where I doubted whether my conversion was real, whether that was just an emotional moment where we were just both emotional and I just felt an ease because of what my dad had said to me. That was when I decided I'm going to study the scriptures and examine it and see if there's anything true about what Dad was saying to me. So I studied the scriptures for like 2 years straight, looking for any excuse to be like, God can't be real. Jesus and everything that he says is false. But as I studied the scriptures more and more, I ended up discovering that God is actually more beautiful, and I was just blown away by what the scriptures were saying at that point. I did everything possible, like held it up against historical accounts, looked for any scientific reason that this stuff couldn't be real. Every argument out there I was going to and being like, this guy is going to prove that God isn't real. And every single time I was coming away thinking, flip, God has to be real. And it came to a point where something miraculous happened. It was just a point where I was like, God is here. This is God moving, and he definitely is real. I went to a church service in Harrogate. The minister at the time was speaking on Paul and the Damascus Road and his conversion to Christianity. And I was like, that's a bit weird because it's very similar to what's happening in my life right now. And I just went away thinking, oh, that's just a coincidence. Like, it's in the scriptures, it's just another story. And then when I went back home, I went to a church service there, and the minister was speaking on the exact same Bible passage, Paul and the Damascus Road. And then someone came and prayed for me and prayed stuff over my life that I was like, who has just told this person what's going on? 3 things have happened here where God is basically saying, I'm real, I am real, I am real. All the studying of the scriptures solidified that he's real and that he's true. And then God makes it more personal by just being there. That was the point where I was like, I gotta give God my all. From that point on, life wasn't the easiest. I still struggled with friendships, and especially in rugby circles, the scene where people were drinking all the time. And eventually God just gave me, sanctified me to a point where I didn't need that in my life and didn't need to be the one always trying to be the party animal or trying to drink more than the other person next to me. God has just slowly worked and brought me to the point where I'm married. I have a job that isn't involved in rugby, and we are now expecting a child, and that is all by the grace of God. That's where he's brought my life from a lowly boy in Fiji who probably, if you looked at it, has no chance of ever becoming anything, and God has used it for his glory. So